It was one of those nights when the heat seemed to cling to your skin, making it impossible to sleep. I was staying at my grandmother's house, a familiar and cozy refuge, but that night the atmosphere felt different. The fan by the bed turned lazily, failing to bring any relief from the stifling heat. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, I decided to get up and grab a glass of water, hoping for some comfort. My grandmother's house always had a peculiar air, filled with memories from the past. Every corner seemed to tell a story, from the framed photos on the walls to the old furniture that creaked under the slightest weight. I usually felt safe there, but that night the silence seemed heavier than usual, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. I got up carefully, trying not to make a sound. As I walked through the dark hallway, I could feel the coolness of the floor beneath my feet. The silence was absolute, so deep that every step seemed amplified. The shadows of the trees outside swayed gently, cast by the faint street lights, and for a moment I thought about going back to bed, but the thirst was stronger. When I reached the kitchen, something made me pause in the hallway for a moment. It wasn't exactly a noise, but a sensation. I glanced around, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. Only the empty hallway stretched before me, wrapped in utter silence. I kept walking, unaware that this night was far from ordinary. As I made my way down the hallway, the darkness of the house seemed to envelop everything. Every light was off, and the faint glow of the moon barely crept through the edges of the curtains. The stillness felt heavier now, as if the house was holding secrets in its shadows. I walked slowly, each step echoing in the silence, my mind distracted by the thought of the cold water waiting for me in the kitchen. As I passed the door that led to the veranda, I instinctively glanced at the glass. At first, I didn't register what I was seeing. It was just a figure, small and shadowed. I stopped in my tracks, squinting to make sense of it. Standing outside, barely illuminated by the dim moonlight, was a boy. He looked no older than 10, his small frame completely still, his face turned toward the glass as if he was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the house, his expression calm but unreadable. There was nothing inherently threatening about him, but something about the way he stood so perfectly still sent a shiver through me. It wasn't natural. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I should approach or retreat. Finally, I swallowed my hesitation and stepped closer to the door, trying to get a better look at him. "Hey, do you need something?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't answer, but his head tilted slightly as if he was listening. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what I was seeing. Who was this boy, and why did he feel so wrong? I stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to say something again. My mouth was dry and my heart thudded in my chest, but I tried to sound calm. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The boy didn't answer. He just kept staring at me through the glass, his face eerily calm, almost too calm for a child in such a situation. Then, slowly and deliberately, he raised one hand and made a vague motion, as if to wave me off. It wasn't a typical wave, it was more like a gesture, as if to say, "I don't need anything. I'm just passing through." The simplicity of the gesture sent chills down my spine. How could he be so composed, so silent? The silence between us felt unnatural, stretching longer and heavier with each second. Determined to make sense of the situation, I decided to approach him directly. "Wait there," I said, more to reassure myself than to give him instruction. My fingers fumbled along the wall until they found the light switch. I flipped it on, flooding the hallway and the area outside the glass door with light. The boy didn't flinch, didn't move. His stillness was unnerving. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping onto the threshold. The night air was warm, and the faint chirp of insects filled the quiet. But the boy, he was gone, just like that. One moment, he was standing right there, and the next, he had vanished as if he had never been there at all. My stomach dropped as I stared out into the empty veranda, the sense of something deeply wrong gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I stepped outside, the warm night air greeted me, but the boy was gone. I blinked, staring at the spot where he had just been. My eyes darted around the veranda and out into the yard, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, no trace of him at all. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. A shiver ran down my spine, completely out of sync with the heat of the night. The feeling was unmistakable. I was being watched. My eyes scanned the shadows, the corners of the veranda, and the faint outlines of the trees beyond the yard. But I saw nothing. Yet the sensation grew stronger, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My breathing quickened, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears. The silence around me no longer felt natural. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was thick with something unseen. I wanted to believe that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the cold knot forming in my stomach refused to let me brush it off. I hesitated on the threshold, and sure as stepping further outside or retreating back inside was the safer option. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside and lock the door, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The sensation of being watched lingered, wrapping around me like a predator stalking its prey. My hands trembled as I gripped the door frame, fighting the urge to shout into the emptiness, demanding to know what was out there. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat and slowly backed into the house, locking the door behind me, though I wasn't sure it would keep whatever was out there away. I returned to my room, but the thought of sleep felt impossible. My heart was still racing, and the silence that once felt comforting in my grandmother's house now felt suffocating. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, expecting at any moment to hear the sound of footsteps or see the boy's figure reappear. The night, once ordinary, had turned into something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to face. The image of the boy lingered in my mind, his silent stare, the way he gestured that he didn't need anything, and then his sudden disappearance. None of it made sense. I tried to rationalize it. Was I dreaming? Could he have been a neighborhood child playing a prank, or was it something much darker? Something I couldn't comprehend. The questions circled endlessly, each answer more unsettling than the last. I stayed awake until the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains, offering a fragile sense of safety. But even in the daylight, the memory of the bow and the chilling feeling of being watched refused to fade. Every time I passed the corridor that led to the veranda, I felt that same icy shiver run down my spine. It was as if the house itself remembered that night, holding on to it like a secret it wouldn't share. To this day, I avoid looking directly at the veranda when I visit my grandmother's house. The fear is still there, lurking just beneath the surface, as if the boar, whatever he was, is still watching, waiting just out of sight. And no matter how much I tell myself it's all in my head, I can't shake the feeling that he was never truly just passing through. After undergoing surgery to remove one of my kidneys, I found myself confined to a military hospital for what felt like an eternity. The sterile white walls and endless, empty corridors gave the place an air of desolation, and the nights were eerily silent, broken only by the occasional hum of distant machinery. At first, it seemed like a place of recovery, but the isolation quickly became oppressive. The hospital had a way of amplifying loneliness. The rooms, though functional, were dimly lit, with shadows that seemed to stretch far longer than they should. I tried to focus on my recovery, but the atmosphere didn't help. The nights were the worst, a heavy silence settling over the place, making even the faintest creak of a floorboard echo unnervingly. For the first few days, everything felt routine. Nurses came and went, administering medications and checking vitals. I followed the schedule they set, trying to ignore the oppressive feeling of the place. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing things small, almost imperceptible details that didn't feel right. A misplaced object here, a faint noise there. At first I brushed it off, blaming it on my weakened state or the haze of medication. But as time passed, these oddities became harder to ignore. It felt as though the hospital itself was alive, watching me, waiting for something, and that was only the beginning. One night, while I was drifting in and out of sleep, I heard the creak of my room's door slowly opening. The sound was soft, deliberate. I assumed it was the nurse coming in to check on me or administer medication. My groggy mind didn't think much of it. At first I was used to their quiet routines. Then I heard something else, the faint clinking of instruments being moved on the small table beside my bed. It was such a specific sound, the soft metallic scrape unmistakable. I kept my eyes half closed, expecting the nurse to speak or adjust my floor, but the room remained unnervingly silent. Suddenly I felt it, a cold breath against my ear. It was faint but deliberate, like someone leaning in far too close. My body jolted awake, and I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the dark room for whoever or whatever had been near me. There was no one. The room was empty, save for the faint glow of the street light filtering through the blinds. The only thing left behind was a lingering scent, faint but unmistakable, the sweet, glowing aroma of flowers. It didn't belong there, and neither did the icy terror that now gripped me. During the late hours of the night, I often heard strange sounds coming from the kitchen near my room. It wasn't just the usual creaks of an old building. It sounded like someone was moving pots, stirring something in a pan, or even chopping vegetables. The noises were so clear and distinct, they almost felt like a comforting reminder of normalcy, as if someone was preparing a late-night meal. Curious and admittedly a bit hungry, I decided to investigate. I quietly slipped out of bed, trying not to disturb the stillness of the night. The hallways were dark and empty, and the only sound was the soft thud of my own footsteps on the cold floor. When I reached the kitchen, I paused, expecting to find someone there, but when I pushed the door open, I was met with an unsettling silence. The kitchen was empty, not a soul in sight. The stove was off, the counters untouched. There were no signs of recent activity. I stood there for a moment, puzzled and unsettled, before retreating back to my room, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just heard. At first I thought it might have been another patient, someone else awake and moving around in the dead of night. But the sounds were so consistent, so real, and they never seemed to stop. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometime later, my mother and younger brother came to visit me, hoping to lift my spirits. I was still recovering, and they figured a walk around the hospital would help ease my mind. I showed them the various sections of the building, trying to make the place seem a little less eerie. It was nice to have some company after weeks of solitude. My brother, being as energetic as he was, ran ahead, his small feet echoing down the empty hallways. As we passed one particular door that was always locked, he stopped and curiously pushed it open with both hands. It was strange, considering I had never seen that door opened before, but I didn't think much of it at the time. In an instant, my brother froze, his small body tensed, and his eyes widened in terror. He stood there, motionless, as if he were staring at something that froze him in place. Then, without warning, he screamed an ear-piercing, gut-wrenching scream that I'll never forget. He bolted towards us, running with a speed and fear I had never seen before. His face was pale, and his little body trembled with panic. My mother and I tried to calm him down, asking what had happened, but all he could do was cry uncontrollably. He couldn't explain it, and when we went to check the door, there was nothing there, just an empty, dark room. He wouldn't speak about it again, and to this day I have no idea what he saw. My mother and I did our best to calm my brother down, asking him over and over what had happened, but all he could do was cry uncontrollably, his small body trembling with fear. We tried to soothe him, but there was no comforting him. Whatever he had seen was far beyond his ability to explain, and even as we held him, I could see that he was still haunted by whatever it was. Determined to find out what had caused such terror, my mother and I approached the door. It was still open, just slightly ajar. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to expect, but we had to know. As we peered into the room, all we saw was darkness and empty, silent space that seemed as lifeless as any other. There was nothing out of place, nothing that could explain the panic in my brother's eyes. Years have passed since that day, and my brother still refuses to talk about what he saw. Every time I bring it up, he changes the subject or simply looks away, as if the memory is too much to bear. And I get it. I've tried asking, tried to make sense of it, but he remains silent. It's as if the truth behind that room, that door, is something too dreadful to even acknowledge. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the hospital held secrets that I'll never understand. Every time I think back on that day, I'm filled with a deep unease, like there's something I missed, something dark lurking beneath the surface of that place. I don't know what my brother saw, but I know one thing for certain. Some doors are better left closed.